This video is going to talk about our second legal remedies under contracts, which is UCC remedies. And the case that we're going to discuss is the chat loss case. What happened in this case? Well, you have a plaintiff who was promised an NCR computer system that would perform specific capabilities. But the good the plaintiff received, which was the 399-656 model, couldn't perform the functions the defendant warranted or promised it would perform. So now the case is before the court, and the court has to address two issues, which is one, should the compensatory damages be measured using the fair market value of the promised NCR computer system, or should it be the contract price? And what is the fair market value of this NCR computer system promise, right? If we decide it's the fair market value and not the contract price. Because this is a tangible, movable object, right? You can move a computer system, you can pick it up. The UCC governs, not the restatement. So the general rule used by the court to determine what compensatory damages should be given to the plaintiff actually appeared in the dissent opinion. It was in paragraph 4, page 564, where the dissent said the purpose is to give the purpose is to put the buyer in the same position he would have been if there had been no breach. And the remedies are not intended to give the purchaser a windfall or treasure trove. The buyer may not receive more than bargained for. And so this general rule is exactly the same as the general rule we discussed for torts compensatory damages, as well as restatement compensatory damages, right? Which is expectancy and reliance, putting the person back in the position they would have been if the contract had never been created or had never been breached, right? So benefit of the bargain, but not giving them more than they've actually lost. Right? So it's the same general rule that we're applying for UCC damages. However, to calculate that actual loss, we're dealing with the specific rule. And the specific rule that applies in this situation where we're dealing with goods to measure the damages is the difference between the fair market value of the goods accepted and the value they would have had if they had been as warranted. And so how did the court determine this, use this calculation to determine the actual damages the plaintiff suffered, right? It was determined originally at the district court, went to the appellate court, was sent back on remand for them to recalculate it using the benefit of the bargain formula. And so what did the court determine? Well, the district court, when it came back and they recalculated using benefit of the bargain, they determined that the fair market value as warranted would have been over $200,000. And they determined that using evidence from Hicks, who recommended the 8200 series as the computer system that would have met the plaintiff's needs, not the 399-656. And then Greenston, which admitted this 8200 series that Hicks said was necessary to do everything the plaintiff needed, was actually 2 levels above the 399-656 model. And then finally, we have this guy named Brandon who's testified that the computer system that would perform all the functions requested by the plaintiff is in the range of $100,000 to $150,000. So they took, this is what they considered the fair market value as warranted based on the evidence. They subtracted the actual value, right, which was the goods accepted, the good that is now in Chatlass's possession, the NCR 399-656, which is valued at $6,000, and determined, well, the plaintiff's remedy is $201,826. And so what now happens with this contract price? Because they originally entered a contract for a computer system that was only worth $46,000. And now the remedy that the defendant's having to pay is over $200,000. Like, how did we get to that point? And so that was the issue that was addressed by the court, which was, what do we do about this contract price given it's so different from the actual fair market value? And so on page 562, when they're discussing what to do with these conflicting numbers, the court said that evidence of a contract price is relevant to determine the fair market value, but it's not controlling, right? So they can consider the 4,600, but they can still look at all the other evidence to determine what the actual fair market value would have been of a computer that would do everything the plaintiff needed, right? Including the fact that they created a contract for $46,000. And so now when we're at the appellate court and they're trying to review the court's award, the district court's award of over $200,000, plus all the testimony that Hicks, Greenston, and Brandon gave, it's kind of doesn't make sense because Brandon is the only one that gave an amount of 100 to 150K, and the district court awarded over 200,000. And so this is where we have to understand a procedural rule where the appellate court's only going to overturn what the district court calculated if it was clearly erroneous. And here, the appellate court determined it wasn't clearly erroneous. It could have been this computer system that Chatlass wanted over 200,000. And the credibility of these, I guess, the credibility of the defendant, the plaintiff, and the people testifying, that's for the district judge to determine. And so the district judge determined from Hicks, Greenstein, and Brandon that it's worth over 200,000, while the appellate court said they're not going to overturn it. And so this was a controversial decision, which is why you had a dissent that said that the contract price has to govern if there's a market of good if the market value of goods differs from the contract price, right? So the contract price was for 399,656, and the 8,200 are not the same, so it's two different. And so the dissent would have given 40,000, where they would have used the contract price as the fair market value, subtracted what the value that Chatlass actually got, and you would have had 40,000 in compensatory damages. Now, in terms of other rules you need to know for the bar exam, as well as our in-class exam related to the sale of goods, the other rule you need to know is a buyer's cover, which showed up on page 560, take note. And so basically, if the buyer makes a good faith effort without reasonable delay to make a reasonable purchase of substitute goods, the measure of damage is the difference between the cost of cover and the contract price. Well, if Chatlass purchased the 8200 series for 150K, what would the remedy be under 2-7112? So one, purchase the 399,656 series, paid the defendant 46K, right, which was the contract price. Realize that this computer can't do what they need. Two, now purchase 8200 series, which does do what they need. So they're covering by buying the computer system they actually wanted. And they paid 150 to a third party, which was the cost it took to cover. And then now we need to calculate what their compensatory damages would be. The compensatory damages would be the cost to cover, 150K, minus the contract price, which is 46K, which leaves us at 104K as their compensatory damages. Because you have to remember, Chatlass always expected to pay at least 46K for the computer system. Again, this is different than the actual case where Chatlass never covered. But we're changing things a little bit so we can see how things work under 2-712. And so you might be thinking, oh, this is weird. 104K is all they get because their total loss was actually 196K, right? They spent 46K to the defendant, and then they spent 150K to a third party. It doesn't seem to add up. And you have to remember that Chatlass still has a 399 in its possession. That's worth 56K. Plus, Chatlass always expected to pay 56K. So if you add it together, which is the compensatory damages they get, 104K, plus the actual computer system they still have, which they can resell, which is 46K, plus they expected to pay 46K, well, that's how you get to the 196K, which is the total loss. Now, do these rules apply to sellers, right? Because in this case, we're dealing with a buyer who got non-conforming goods. But what happens if a seller sends something to a buyer and the buyer rejects the goods and the seller has performed properly under the contract? These rules showed up in points of discussion, page 560, paragraph 2. Under the UCC, sellers have the same choice between recovering between the difference between the contract price promise and the market value of the goods, or if the seller actually resells the property in a reasonable transaction, similar to how a buyer buys the property in a reasonable transaction, then the seller has the choice to do the difference between the contract price and the actual sale price, right? So they get the resale price. And we'll practice applying these rules in class, but the main takeaway for UCC are if a buyer gets non-conforming goods and the buyer does not cover, no cover, then the buyer gets the difference between the fair market value and the good received. If the buyer does cover by purchasing substitute goods, then the buyer gets the difference between the cost to cover and the contract price. Now, if a seller sends conforming goods and they're rejected from the buyer, which means the buyer breached, and there was no resale of the goods, the seller gets the difference between the fair market value and the contract price. But if the seller resells this good to another third party, then the seller gets the difference between the resale price and the contract price. And so these are the summarized rule statements that I would commit to memory for the exam.